Good afternoon, Reading Room. We are here continuing our reading of the book Ethics for a New Millennium by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. We're coming close to a close. We are on chapter 13, Ethics in Society. When we are committed to the ideal of concern for others, it follows that this should inform our social and political policies. I say this not because I suppose that thereby we will be able to solve all society's problems overnight. Rather, it is my conviction that unless this wider sense of compassion, which I have been urging on the reader, inspires our politics, our policies are likely to harm instead of serve humanity as a whole. We must, I believe, take practical steps to acknowledge our responsibility to all others, both now and in the future. This is true even where there may be little practical difference between those policies that are motivated by this compassion and those that are motivated by, for example, national interest. Now, although it is certainly the case that if my suggestions concerning compassion, interdiscipline, wise discernment, and the cultivation of virtue were to be implemented widely, the world would automatically become a kinder, more peaceful place. I believe that reality compels us to tackle our problems at the level of society at the same time as that of the individual. The world will change when each individual makes the attempt to counter their negative thoughts and emotions, and when we practice compassion for its inhabitants, irrespective of whether or not we have direct relationships with them. In view of this, there are, I believe, a number of areas to which we need to give special consideration in the light of universal responsibility. These include education, the media, our natural environment, politics and economics, peace and disarmament, and interreligious harmony. Each has a vital role to play in shaping the world we live in, and I propose to examine them briefly in turn. Before doing so, I must stress that the views I express are personal. They are also the views of someone who claims to no expertise with respect to the technicalities of these matters. But if what I say seems objectionable, my hope is that it will at least give the reader pause for thought. For although it would not be surprising to see a divergence of opinion concerning how they are to be translated into actual policy, the need for compassion, for basic spiritual values, for inner discipline, and the importance of ethical conduct generally are, in my view, incontrovertible. Education and the media. Whether visiting one of our schools for Tibetan refugees in India or speaking to student audiences abroad, I am always very happy to meet young people. They have a natural enthusiasm for justice and peace, and they tend to be much more open and flexible of the mind than adults. No matter how well disposed toward change we are, we adults undoubtedly find it more difficult. Meeting the young also reminds me that children constitute humanity's most precious resource. Given that their moral outlook is largely shaped by their upbringing, it is essential we educate them responsibly. The human mind, is both the source and properly directed the solution to all our problems. Those who attain great learning but lack a good heart are in danger of falling prey to the anxieties and restlessness which result from desires incapable of fulfillment. Conversely, a genuine understanding of spiritual values has the opposite effect. When we bring up our children to have knowledge without compassion, their attitude toward others is likely to be a mixture of envy of those in positions above them, aggressive competitiveness toward their peers, and scorn for those less fortunate. This leads to a propensity toward greed, presumption, excess, and very quickly to loss of happiness. Knowledge is important, but much more so is the use toward which it is put. This depends on the heart and mind of the one who uses it. Education is much more than a master of imparting the knowledge and skills by which narrow goals are achieved. It is also about opening the child's eyes to the needs and rights of others. We must show children their actions have a universal dimension, and we must somehow find a way to build on their natural feelings of empathy so that they come to have a sense of responsibility towards others. For it is this which stirs us into action. Indeed, if we had to choose between learning and virtue, the latter is definitely more valuable. The good heart, which is the fruit of virtue, is by itself a great benefit to humanity. Mere knowledge is not. How, though, are we to teach morality to our children? I have a sense that in general, modern educational systems neglect discussion of ethical matters. This is probably not intentional so much as a byproduct of historical reality. Secular educational systems were developed at a time when religious institutions were still highly influential throughout society. Because ethical and human values were and still are generally held to fall within the scope of religion, it is assumed that this aspect of a child's education would be looked after through his or her religious upbringing. This worked well enough until the influence of religion began to decline. But now, though the need is still there, it is not being met. Therefore, we must find some other way of showing children that basic human values are important. We must also help them to develop these values. Ultimately, of course, the importance of concern for others is learned not from words, but from actions. The example we set. This is why the family environment itself is such a vital component of a child's upbringing. When a caring and compassionate atmosphere is absent from the home, when children are neglected by their parents, it is easy to recognize their damaging effects. The children tend to feel helpless and insecure, and their minds are often agitated. Conversely, when children receive constant affection and protection, they tend to be much happier and more confident in their abilities. Their physical health tends to be better too. And we find that they are concerned not just for themselves, but others as well. The home environment is also important because children learn negative behaviors from their parents. If, for example, the father is always getting into fights with his associates, or if the father and mother are always arguing destructively, although at first the child may find this objectionable, eventually they will come to understand it is quite normal. This learning is then taken out of the home and into the world. And it also goes without saying that what children learn about ethical conduct at school has to be practiced first. In this, teachers have a special responsibility. By their own behavior, they can make children remember them for their whole lives. If this behavior is principled, disciplined, and compassionate, their values will be readily impressed on the child's mind. This is because the lesson taught by a teacher with a positive motivation, kun long, penetrates deepest into their students' minds. I know this from my own experience. As a boy, I was very lazy, but when I was aware of the affection and concern of my tutors, their lessons would generally sink in much more successfully than if one of them was harsh and unfeeling that day. So far as and what would sink in is the harsh, unfeeling behavior and attitude, and then you'd be sort of thinking about that. So far as specifics of education are concerned, that is for the experts. I will therefore confine myself to a few suggestions. The first is that in order to awaken young people's conscience to the importance of basic human values, it is better not to present society's problems purely as an ethical matter, or as a religious matter. It is important to emphasize that what is at stake is our continued survival. This way, they will come to see that the future lies in their hands. Secondly, I do believe that dialogue can and should be taught in class. Presenting students with a controversial issue and having them debate it is a wonderful way to introduce them to the concept of resolving conflict non-violently. Indeed, one would hope that if schools were to make this a priority, it could have a beneficial effect on family life itself. On seeing his or her parents wrangling, a child that had understood the value of dialogue would instinctively say, "Oh no, that's not the way. You have to talk to discuss things properly." Finally, it is essential that we eliminate from our schools' curricula any tendency toward presenting others in a negative light. There are undoubtedly some parts of the world where the teaching of history, for example, fosters bigotry and racism toward other communities. Of course, this is wrong. It contributes nothing to the happiness of humanity. Now more than ever, we need to show our children that distinctions between my country and your country, my religion and your religion, are secondary considerations. Rather, we must insist on the observation that my right to happiness carries no more weight than others' right. This is not to say that I believe we should educate children to abandon or ignore the culture and historical tradition they were born into. On the contrary, it is very important they be grounded in these. It is good for children to learn to love their country, their religion, their culture, and so on. But the danger comes when this develops into a narrow-minded nationalism, ethnocentricity, and religious bigotry. The example Mahatma Gandhi is pertinent here. Even though we had a very high level of Western education, he never forgot or became estranged from the rich heritage of his Indian culture. If education constitutes one of the most powerful weapons in our quest to bring about a better, more peaceful world, the mass media is another. As every political figure knows, they are no longer the only ones with authority in society. In addition to that of newspapers and books, radio, film, and television together have an influence over individuals unimagined 100 years ago. This power confers great responsibility on all who work in the media, but it also confers great responsibility on each of us who as individuals listen and read and watch. We too have a role to play. We are not powerless before the media. The control switch is in our own hand after all. This does not mean that I advocate bland reporting or entertainment without excitement. On the contrary, so far as investigative journalism is concerned, I respect and appreciate the media's interference. Not all public servants are honest in discharging their duties. It is appropriate, therefore, to have journalists, their noses as long as an elephant's trunk, snooping around and exposing wrongdoing where they find it. We need to know when this or that renowned individual hides a very different aspect behind a pleasant exterior. There should be no discrepancy between external appearances and the individual's inner life. It is the same person, after all. Such discrepancies suggest them to be untrustworthy. At the same time, it is vital that the investigator does not act out of improper motives. Without impartiality and without due respect for the other's rights, the investigation itself becomes tainted. With regard to the question of the media's emphasis on sex and violence, there are many factors to consider. In the first instance, it is clear that much of the viewing public enjoys the sensations provoked by this sort of material. Secondly, I very much doubt that those producing material containing a lot of explicit sex and violence intend harm by it. Their motives are surely just commercial. As to whether this is positive or negative in itself is, to my mind, less important than the question of whether it can have an ethically wholesome effect. If the result is seeing a film in which there is a lot of violence, is that the viewer's compassion is aroused, then perhaps that depiction of violence would be justified. But if the accumulation of violent images leads to indifference, then I think it is not. Indeed, such a hardening of heart is potentially dangerous. It leads all too easily to lack of empathy. When the media focuses too closely on the negative aspects of human nature, there is a danger that we become persuaded that violence and aggression are its principal characteristics. This is a mistake, I believe. The fact that violence is newsworthy suggests the very opposite. Good news is not remarked on precisely because there is so much of it. Consider that at any given moment, there must be hundreds of millions of acts of kindness taking place around the world. Although there will undoubtedly be many acts of violence in progress at the same time, their number is surely very much less. If, therefore, the media is to be ethically responsible, it needs to reflect this simple fact. Clearly, it is necessary to regulate the media. The fact that we prevent our children from watching certain things indicates that we already discriminate between what is and is not appropriate according to different circumstances. But whether legislation is the right way to go about this is hard to judge. As in all matters of ethics, discipline is only really effective when it comes from within. Perhaps the best way to ensure that the output various media providers is healthy lies in the way we educate our children. If we bring them up to be aware of their responsibilities, they will be more disciplined when they become involved in the media. Although it is perhaps too much to hope that the media will actually promote the idea and principles of compassion, at least we should be able to expect that those involved will take care when there is the potential for negative impact. At least there should be no room for the incitement of negative acts, such as racist violence. But beyond this, I don't know. Perhaps we might be able to find a way to connect more directly those who create stories for news and entertainment with viewers, the readers, and listeners. Oh, let's see here. Yeah, so we have a ways to go in this chapter, it looks like, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he goes through each one of those points for quite a while. So the next point is the natural world. All right, so that's all we're going to complete today on our book. Our book is Ethics for a New Millennium by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. It says I have 5 views there, and then it says I have 0 views. So anyway, glad that YouTube can count up to those big numbers. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom. Specifically, this is our reading room, and I'll see you here tomorrow. Thanks.